Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Franklin Roosevelt and the focus is the second New Deal. The year is 1933 and the chaotic legislative blitz of the 100 days is now over. Now it's time to implement all that new legislation as part of the New Deal, and there were plenty of bumps along the way here in the first term of Franklin Roosevelt. Partly because Secretary Harold Ickes, in charge of the Public Works Administration, was too risk-averse. He was too slow. Money wasn't rolling out, and the unemployment situation, well over 20%, still a big problem now in the second half of 1933. So the administration set up the Civil Works Administration and put the much more aggressive Harry Hopkins in charge of that. Again, trying to put people to work, get some benefits, kind of some smaller construction projects, but again, get that money running. They did it for about 6 months. About $1 billion went into this program, but after that they shut it down. Didn't really see this as part of the long-term solution and the role of the federal government. It was a step in the right direction, again, trying to energize the New Deal activity to become fully implementable. There was reform going on in partly due to in the area of the currency. And we talked about in the last episode, the United States going off the gold standard. And as Franklin Roosevelt told in his fireside chats, we are thus continuing to move toward a managed currency, kind of new territory for the United States having a managed currency. But what did that mean in terms of actually setting the price of gold in the United States? Well, Henry Morgenthau tells the story. The actual price of gold on any given day made little difference. Our object was simply to keep the trend gradually upward, hoping that commodity prices would follow. One day, when I must have come in more than usually worried about the state of the world, we were planning an increase from 19 to 22 cents. Roosevelt took one look at me and suggested a rise of 21 cents. It's a lucky number, the president said with a laugh, because it's 3 times 7. I noted in my diary at the time, if anybody ever knew how we really set the price of gold through a combination of lucky numbers, etc., I think they really would be frightened. Well, maybe so. They tried to keep that quiet, again, trying to prime the pump of the economy in a variety of different ways. There was plenty of criticism in these early days of implementing the New Deal, and not only from the right, but also from the left. The conservatives were basically saying this is Marxist, communist-like activity that the administration was putting into place. Al Smith, the conservative Democrat, now a rival of Roosevelt, said, let me give one solemn warning. There can only be one capital, Washington or Moscow. There can only be one atmosphere of government, the clean, pure, fresh air of free America or the foul breath of communistic Russia, which Al Smith was implying. That's exactly where Roosevelt was taking the United States. As far as the former president, the conservative Republican, Herbert Hoover, well, he said the New Deal was simply an attempt to crossbreed socialism, fascism, and free enterprise. A crossbreed in his mind that was simply never going to work, and certainly destructive more than productive for the United States. But the criticism wasn't only coming from the conservatives, it was also coming from the left. The far left didn't think the New Deal was going far enough. Some examples, you had Francis Townsend, who had 25 million supporters advocating every single day to actually give money in terms of these old age pensions, $200 a month for anybody over the age of 60 who was willing to leave the workforce. There were really confusion as to exactly how he was going to pay for all this, but it sounded popular to his supporters, again, farther than Roosevelt certainly was willing to go in pushing some of these reforms. Similarly, you had Father Charles Coughlin, the radio priest who had tens of millions of listeners tuning into his radio broadcast every Sunday afternoon, an anti-aristocratic message of Robin Hood-like, take from the rich and give to the poor, not that different from the Kingfish. Huey Long, the former governor of Louisiana, now a senator from that state, who had established his Share Our Wealth Society. His plan, guarantee wages for all workers across the country. How would you do it? Through taxation, redistribution of wealth. Tax the rich, give to the poor. Long also had 3 or 4 million followers, and a little bit nervous. Maybe he'll run for president on a third party. That could certainly create some chaos. So plenty of pressure on Roosevelt from the right and the left. And a lot of this was going to be assessed based on the electoral outcomes. The elections of 1934, the midterms, and here was an opportunity for the electorate to weigh in. Did they like the path that the country was on following Roosevelt's New Deal? Well, typically in these first midterm elections for a new president, things went the other way, and the opposite party from the one in power in the White House would typically gain seats. Not this time. The people were with Roosevelt. They sent Democrats into the House and into the Senate. 12 pickups in the House, 9 pickups in the Senate for the Democrats. The Democrats now had 39 out of the state houses in terms of the governorships across the country. This was a really strong vote of confidence for Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal, the Democrats. He was ready to pull forward, even though there were other setbacks. We turn the calendar now into 1935. These setbacks, where did they come from? The judiciary, the Supreme Court starting to declare New Deal legislation unconstitutional, one by one, including the far-reaching National Recovery Administration, the NRA, that went under. There were some concerns in the administration that other legislation could follow, including some of the things that they were working on for long-term reform. And this is really the essence of this second New Deal. Not short-term fixes, not just quick jobs to get people back to work, but long-term reform. As Roosevelt said, social justice, no longer a distant ideal, has become a definite goal. Structural reforms would lead to that social justice. January of 1935, the administration introduced the Social Security Act. It had 3 major provisions, focusing on unemployment insurance, old age pensions, and public health insurance. Major reforms that the United States had never gone down this path before. There were going to be challenges in Congress, potentially with the courts as well. How do they craft legislation that would accomplish these reforms, but would also pass constitutional muster with this particular Supreme Court? Well, they decided on unemployment insurance, for example, to actually follow the lead of the court. And the court had recently determined in another case that it was constitutional to use tax offsets for the federal government to reimburse states for state programs, because most agree that unemployment insurance in the United States system should be a state program. But the way they set it up in the Social Security Act is that through these tax offsets, the federal government would actually be able to pay 90% of those unemployment insurance benefits, as long as each state would actually stand up an unemployment insurance program. Sure enough, after the act passed, 100% states did this to get those 90% of the payments. It was a critical part of reform that had never existed on a national basis in the United States before. What about the old age pensions? Well, this was not just about the dignity of the end of life and giving people some money and so they didn't have to work in their old age. It was about also helping the able-bodied 18 to 65-year-olds get more jobs. Because if you took, through old age pensions, the elderly out of the workforce, you passed some child labor reform laws, you take the younger under 18-year-olds out of the labor workforce, and all of a sudden there are more jobs to go to those from 18 to 65. It would lower unemployment, increase wages. That was part of the objective, in addition to the quality of life concerns for the elderly with these old age pensions. Again, the question was how to fund it and how to do it in a constitutional way. Roosevelt was against the idea of simply paying this out of the federal government treasury. No. He wanted contributions to come from employers and employees, starting at 1% of their payroll up to 3% it would increase to over time. Now, the question was, is it good to raise taxes on people in the middle of a depression when you have all this unemployment? Well, Roosevelt said that missed the point. According to Roosevelt, I guess you're right on the economics, but those taxes were never a problem of economics. They are politics all the way through. We put those payroll contributions there so as to give the contributors a legal, moral, and political right to collect their pensions and their unemployment benefits. With those taxes in there, no damn politician can ever scrap my Social Security program, and he was right. It certainly locked it in. History would prove this to be one of the biggest reforms, certainly coming out of the Roosevelt administration. They didn't get the health insurance provision. That proved to be a bridge too far with this Congress, but they did get the major planks of the unemployment insurance and also the old age pensions. This was true reform, lasting impact. In fact, Francis Perkins would later say that the Social Security Act was the cornerstone of his administration. More long-term reform came in the area of labor in this second New Deal. The NRA, which now unconstitutional, had some labor provisions in it, but didn't really get very well implemented, and again, now unconstitutional anyway. So Roosevelt actually partnered with Senator Robert Wagner on another shot at long-term labor reform. It became the the Labor Relations Act, which bear the name of Senator Wagner, and what it would do was establish a new board, the National National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, and this would again be real reform under their oversight. They would oversee elections now in labor. They would no longer allow organizations to commit what they called unfair labor practices, which again would be adjudicated by the NLRB. Also, employers would no longer have the choice not to bargain with the unions, and the unions based on elected by the representatives of the workers as opposed to identified top-down by management. So these were very different rules under which the labor management relationships would go on going forward. This would pass and all of a sudden have an immediate impact on labor. Went from about 3 million people in unions to about 8 million by the time it was at the end of the decade, and also a very different approach because now workers had some place to go. They didn't have to go to the picket line and have violence against their employers. They could go to the boardroom and hire lawyers and plead their case and potentially get relief from the NLRB. It was also smart politics because this was very favorable, obviously, for the union membership. The Democratic Party basically became the de facto party of labor, not only for now, but for many decades to come. Another area of major long-term reform coming out of this second New Deal. In the meantime, though, the country is still suffering. Unemployment is falling a bit, but it's still over 20% in 1935, with 10 million people out of work. So Roosevelt again asked for more money, needed to begin prime that pump. $4.8 billion came along with the Emergency Relief Appropriations Act. Some of it went to Ickes and the Public Works Administration, but more of it again went to Harry Hopkins. This time they created the Work Progress Administration. Again, put people to work, long-term benefits, things like rural electrification, construction projects, some landmark development efforts. In New York City, the Triborough Bridge, the Lincoln Tunnel, LaGuardia Airport. On the West Coast, you had the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. In Florida, the Overseas Highway in the Florida Keys. It created 500,000 new miles of highways, 100,000 new bridges, 2,500 hospitals were built, 13,000 playgrounds, 8,000 parks. 3 million people were put to work by Harry Hopkins and the PWA, or the WPA rather, in the first year alone. This was a combination of both relief, recovery, and a little bit of reform mixed in, but again, all part of that push to help the American people still suffering in the Great Depression. Election year of 1936. There have been a lot of changes so far in the Roosevelt administration. A lot of the original folks were now gone. Ray Moley had resigned. The budget director, Lewis Douglas, was out. He was unhappy that they couldn't get to a balanced budget. Hugh Johnson was out when the NRA was ruled unconstitutional. Rex Tugwell will be out soon. And finally, Howe also passed away. Roosevelt's most intimate political advisor and confidant, dating back to the days in the New York Senate, the Navy position, the governor of New York, living in the White House, but he had been ill really since the beginning of the administration, and eventually his body gave out. It was a very sad ending, highly impactful to both Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, who certainly mourned the loss, and Louis Howe knew this was going to be a changing point for Franklin Roosevelt. He basically said just before he died, Franklin is on his own now. Well, it wasn't quite the case. He still had plenty of people around him, but a lot of those intimates were now gone. Really, the only one truly left who would certainly tell him what was on her mind was Missy LeHand, still running the Oval Office, still being his gatekeeper and is, again, a very close confidant, but a lot of the other people were simply now gone. Roosevelt had to move on without them. Time to run for re-election in 1936. Certainly he had a very strong record in his mind to run on, the New Deal, recovery, and reform. But he also added another element into the mix, more focused than ever before. This was going to be an element of class warfare that Roosevelt announced in his State of the Union address January 3 of 1936. Kind of a screed against the aristocrats, of which, of course, he had been one all his life. According to Roosevelt, that we have earned the hatred of entrenched greed. They seek the restoration of their selfish power. Give them their way and they will take the course of autocracy of the past, power for themselves, enslavement for the public. Franklin Roosevelt getting the title traitor to his class because, again, this was his world, these were his people, but he was now representing the common man, the forgotten man, creating for the politics, at least of this, very much of a class warfare kind of scene. Now, Ray Moley, again, had left the administration a couple years before, but he had still continued to work with Roosevelt behind the scenes on policies and speeches and was helping him get ready for the Democratic Convention in 1936, was at the White House for a dinner, and got into a big argument with Roosevelt, a big argument that made a lot of people around them very uncomfortable as it was ensuing, because Moley, in part, just didn't understand why Roosevelt was trying to divide the country on this rich versus poor issue. According to Moley, that in the end, these assumptions cannot help but create, as they have created, class feeling of the most intense sort, and needlessly. For there's no reason why honorable and progressive businessmen should be made to feel that the government is not their government too. Well, Roosevelt said, in the end, this really misses the point, because Mr. Moley, this election, well, there's one issue in this campaign. It's myself. And people must be either for me or against me. Well, this is not what Moley had signed up for. He had signed up for ideas, not necessarily for a person. The relationship with Moley was basically now over. He would continue in his public life criticizing Roosevelt and the New Deal, really for the rest of his existence. As for the election, though, Roosevelt did go and accept the renomination from his fellow Democrats, 100,000 people on hand at Philadelphia's Franklin Field. This time it was a little bit of a stumble, and I mean a physical stumble. Once again, Roosevelt planning to walk arm in arm, in this case with his son Jimmy, to the podium to accept the nomination, and in this rare moment, he stumbled and fell. And as Roosevelt said, as his speech sort of scattered all over the place, "Clean me up, keep your feet off those damn sheets," he ordered the people around him. Later admitted, "I was the damnedest, maddest white man at that moment you ever saw. It was the most frightful 5 minutes of my life," in part because this was so rare that Roosevelt actually fell, certainly in public, but again, it didn't matter, because within a couple of minutes, he was up again. Somehow his internal perseverance came through, head up, smiling, gave another really impactful speech in which he said to these people, "There is a mysterious cycle in human events. To some generations, much is given. Of other generations, much is expected. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny. Him, the New Deal, real reform, that was part of that destiny, according to Franklin Roosevelt." In his final speech in this campaign, he though came back to that topic, rich versus poor, and where he stood on this issue. Madison Square Garden last week at the campaign. Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hatred for me, and I welcome their hatred. I should like to have it said of my first administration that in it the forces of selfishness and of lust for power met their match. I should like to have it said of my second administration that in it these forces met their master. Well, he was creating that class divide in the minds of the American people, and the people loved it. Unemployment did start to help Roosevelt a little bit, because in 1936 it did start to fall a bit, but mostly he was right. This election was about him, the confidence that the American people had in him, and it was a landslide victory even bigger than the one that he had 4 years before. This time over Alf Landon, the Republican nominee, he won 46 out of 48 states. The Electoral College was 523 to 8, the biggest landslide in the Electoral College in over 100 years, going back to the second election of James Monroe back in the 1820s. Again, FDR was right. In the end, this was about him. His optimism, his ability to assure and self-assure and reassure the American people, his confidence. It was infectious. They liked the activity, the experimentation. The American people more than happy to give him 4 more years to figure out how to continue to help them, because unemployment was still up there, but that was his charge, and that's the story for another day. That's Franklin Roosevelt and the second New Deal from the life of Franklin Roosevelt. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.